Welcome back to Cowboy Custom Diesel. Today we are going to be removing a transmission out of a 7.3 Powerstroke diesel in the gravel. Okay, so you want to make sure you have your truck, make sure you have your tools on hand, and also a good quality transmission jack. We're going to start by grabbing a sheet of plywood and putting that under the truck. This is going to be super important because with the weight of the transmission on the transmission jack in the gravel, you will not be able to get it to budge. Having a sheet of plywood or two makes it and so you can scoot it back and forth. It's also a good idea to grab some carpet remnants. This protects your knees and your elbows. Now we're going to remove all the transmission fluid out of the pan. I'm going to drain it into a big 5-gallon bucket and be able to save that for later. Next, we're going to remove the battery cables from both batteries. That way we don't short anything out. By now our transmission fluid is all drained, so now we can move over to removing the inspection cover over the torque converter and flex plate. You should have 4 bolts that hold this cover on, and then it will pop right off. Next up is putting a breaker bar up against the frame rail on your crank. This will keep the motor from turning as you go around and loosen each of the torque converter bolts. Now, when we did this, someone had used a non-approved nut on the torque converter and it was stripped out, and so we actually ended up having to cut that stud off the torque converter. We're going to be replacing the flex plate and the torque converter, so we weren't too worried about ruining anything here. You'll notice that there is a little block here between the torque converter and the flex plate. That little block is welded to the torque converter, and that's where we chose to cut. Once all the torque converter bolts are out, next we move over to the starter and remove the trigger wire for the starter up on the top side. Once that is off, we can now remove the starter hot cable off of the starter solenoid. Now there are 3 bolts that hold the starter on. I like to start with the easiest ones to get to, but don't remove them all the way because you don't want the starter to fall on your face. Here's the back bolt. We get that out of the way. Then I will now remove the 2 front ones that were just hand tight and carefully lower the starter down. Now this thing is really heavy. It's kind of unbalanced. If you're not careful, it will fall right on your face, so be careful. Next up is removing the 12mm bolts that hold the rear drive shaft onto the back of the transfer case. We found that this was easier to remove these bolts with the skid plate removed. So if your truck has a skid plate, take that off now, and that will give you better access to be able to remove the driveline bolts. Just like the starter, I like to leave some of the bolts in hand tight. This way the driveline won't accidentally fall on me. Then I can come back later and remove those ones at the end. You might have to pry the driveline a little bit to get it off of the transfer case flange, and then we can move to the rear driveline. So on this 2000 F250, the rear driveline bolts are held on by little 5/16 bolts that are really notorious for stripping out, especially if they're rusted at all. So I took a nut and welded it onto the head of the existing bolts. And this made it and so I could take a larger socket and loosen the bolts without any issue. I'll probably replace these with new hardware when I go to reinstall the transmission. So here you can actually see a little bit more of a close-up of the hardware. There's the U-bolt strap. Here is the bolt with the nut welded on the head. And then, of course, the original style bolt. Okay, so at this point, we're going to come back and go to the front drive line, and we're going to loosen the bolts, just like the bolts for the rear drive line on the transfer case. Once these guys are hand tight, now we're going to go to the front axle and remove these bolts. The great thing is these bolts are a little more shielded than the ones on the rear axle, and so they will come out easier. Now we can remove the entire front drive line. The rear part of the front drive line will actually stay captive on the transmission crossmember, so you don't have to worry about it falling in your face. So we removed it from the front axle first, and then worked the drive line down and out towards the front of the truck. Okay, once we got the front drive line out, we can move on to the electronics. Removing the connector for the transmission range selector. This one can get caked with dirt and can be hard to remove. Next, we want to remove the shift cable off of the lever and then remove the cable out of the bracket. Okay, now we can remove the connectors off of the electric four-wheel drive shifter, if you have this option on your truck, there are two connectors that go into the actuator. Here you get both of these connectors disconnected, and we will move on to the transmission cooler lines. Now, I was able to take my wrench and just loosen just the fitting on the transmission line. Sometimes you may have to take a wrench and hold the fitting that goes into the transmission bypass tube and into the transmission. Still, I was able to do it with just removing the transmission line. Okay, here is the front transmission line. It is up near where the dipstick tube goes into the transmission pan. Same deal, just get that fitting loose, and there shouldn't be a lot of transmission fluid that will come out at this point because we already drained the transmission. With these fittings loose, we are ready to move over and get our transmission jack. We're going to bring this in underneath the truck and jack up the transmission from the transmission pan just enough to relieve the pressure. You can see that I did take the bolts that hold the cross member to the transmission out, and now we will jack it up just a little bit to relieve the pressure. Over on the passenger side, we're going to start removing the captive bolts that hold the transmission cross member in. There are two that go from a bracket on the cross member to a bracket to the frame, two that hold that bracket to the frame on the frame, and finally, there are two more up on the side of the frame that hold that upper bracket in. Once you have all 6 of these bolts removed, we can go over to the driver's side and remove the 3 smaller bolts that hold that side of the transmission cross member on. These 3 bolts removed, we can now remove the cross member. Make sure that the transmission jack is pushing up on the transmission enough to relieve the pressure of the weight of the transmission off this cross member. Now I'm going to pull it out towards the passenger side. Here you can see the upper bracket and the actual full transmission cross member. Now we are going to lower the entire transmission assembly down just a little bit and make sure that we attach it to the jack with a ratchet strap so it doesn't fall down later. And we're going to lower it down just enough to be able to access up inside to the upper bell housing bolts. We used a whole bunch of socket extensions to be able to reach these 2 bolts. The top right bell housing bolt also has a bracket that holds on the dipstick tube. You want to make sure that when you're reinstalling the transmission that this bracket does not get pinched between the bell housing and the back of the motor. I've had this happen multiple times, and it's really frustrating trying to take everything back apart just over one little piece that's stuck. Now we're going to remove the 2 mid bell housing bolts, one on each side. The one on the passenger side can be a little tricky to get to, especially if you have an aftermarket exhaust. This truck has a 5-inch straight pipe with a 4-inch downpipe, but with a little bit of finesse, you can get in there and be able to access the bolt. Now keep in mind that we are leaving 2 of the bolts left, this bottom one on the passenger side and the bottom one on the driver's side. This is still holding the transmission to the motor at this point, and we want to make sure that everything else is disconnected before we pull these 2 bolts. Up on the top of the transmission, we're going to remove the output speed sensor and any other electrical connectors that we forgot earlier. Double check that everything has been disconnected so we can now remove the 2 lower bell housing bolts. This one can be a trick to get to, especially with the aftermarket exhaust. We found later that using a whole bunch of extensions and accessing it from farther back was more helpful, but you can get it with some little stubby wrenches. Over on the driver's side, plenty of space for this lower bell housing bolt. Just zip that thing right out. And now we are ready to separate the transmission from the engine. I like to double check to make sure that I've removed all the bell housing bolts and everything else is out of the way. We can now grab a pry bar and start carefully separating the transmission bell housing from the engine. You want to go little increments on each side, pry a little bit on the passenger side, pry a little bit on the driver's side, slowly working the transmission jack back and achieving that separation between the 2 units. We want the torque converter to come out with the transmission, alright? One connector we forgot was the solenoid pack selector. That is a lot easier to access now with the transmission dropped down a little bit, and then we have a speed sensor at the front of the transmission too. Now our wiring harness is completely disconnected. I'm going to wrap that up and move it completely out of the way so we don't get in the way of it when we are dropping the entire transmission and transfer case assembly down. Now all we have to do is get this whole thing out from underneath the truck. It is a lot easier to remove it out from the driver's side because you don't have the exhaust, transmission lines, and other stuff hanging down out of the way. We used a semi-truck transmission jack, which is up higher than most transmission jacks, so we had a little bit of a trick getting the actual unit out from underneath the truck. One funny thing is we found a 10 millimeter socket up on top of the transmission that had been there for who knows how long. One thing I want to mention with removing a transmission on gravel is making sure that your jacks and everything are stable and making sure that you do not go under a vehicle that's held up only with hydraulic power. Now we have the transmission out and we are going to get ready to install a BD Diesel Performance transmission from BD Performance Manufacturing. Stay posted for that video and thanks for sticking along with us on this removal.